our international guest from Tartu University, AveliinaHelm. Welcome, Aveliina. Aveliina will talk us about the historical land use as a guide to current conservation. Welcome. I think we now see Aveliina's presentation, but we don't hear your voice.
You have muted your microphone, at least.
Yes.
Okay, now, thank you.
Okay, now, good.
Thank you. Thank you first for inviting me over. It's very interesting to give this webinar, and I will tell about how we can use historical maps and knowledge of historical land use to guide our current decisions in conservation and also in restoration. And I just provide an overview of the things, of the research that has been done and how these historical land use impacts biodiversity and which mechanisms are behind it. So in short, landscapes have its memory. So historical land use has long-lasting impact on communities and on biodiversity, even if they have changed very much. Even if the landscapes have changed or the land use has changed, the impact of those historical activities are still visible. And there are two reasons. First, biodiversity itself, it takes time to accumulate. So habitat continuity throughout the history plays very important role in what we see currently in our habitats, in our communities. Also, species and biodiversity have very slow response to environmental changes. So often we see quite large changes in, let's say, habitat area or even environmental conditions, but we still recognize the historical impacts from the past and not from the current kind of conditions. So there are two phenomena. One is called extinction depth, which means that although the conditions have turned unsuitable to many species, they can still linger on in the landscapes due to the very slow response. And also, even if the changes have not been so big, we can still detect the impact of past land use in current communities. And I will show some examples of what I mean under these. And of course, these notions have very significant implications to conservation. So we actually need to consider historical aspects more in our conservation. As you know, in most of the European countries, I would say many, but it's actually all European countries, it's the trend that semi-natural grasslands that harbor a large part of our biodiversity have considerably declined. So this is the decline of habitat area of semi-natural grasslands in Estonia. Only 100 years ago, we had 1.8 million hectares of semi-natural grasslands, which means around 1/3 of the total area of Estonia was covered by grasslands. Here, this orange line is representing all grasslands, despite what it says above, and the blue line underneath is the coverage of wooded meadows, which historically covered 850,000 hectares, but nowadays managed is actually less than 700. And there are two implications in this. First, we see that if something has declined so severely, it must have impact also on the landscape scale and regional scale biodiversity. Secondly, these trends need to be considered in the conservation and restoration. These are if we see such kind of declines, these are the indications that we need to do something really urgently. Here are some examples of how the landscape changes have occurred, let's say in Estonia, where I come from. And this is Muhu Island in the western part of Estonia, small island that I know many Finnish people have visited, and also other. This was historically covered by grasslands and with relatively little forest and even less fields. Nowadays the pattern has changed considerably. The grasslands are in minority and have been replaced by fields and young forests. This is one landscape picture of how historical and current Alvar grasslands, or these calcareous grasslands that are characteristic to the region, looked like 100 years ago and nowadays. And sometimes they also look something like this, which is the result of the Soviet time afforestation of these grasslands. They have very shallow soil, these type of grasslands, so it needed a big laborious work to actually plant trees in there. Here in the above you see a man making a hole in the limestone in order to place an explosion hole and then make a bigger hole and plant a tree there. And underneath is a big tractor that drives through the shingle in order to create these ditches that you see on the left hand side. Even more changes have happened throughout Estonia, with especially regarding the dry and mesic meadows. Here is the historical coverage of this very broadly distributed habitat type that nowadays is almost completely replaced by agricultural fields in most of Estonia. And there are, of course, implications and kind of ecological knowledge that we have to take from this as well. For example, if we look our preserved grasslands nowadays, these grasslands that have still left, they bear a memory from the past. For example, in our western Estonian grasslands, the historical human population density in Iron Age, it is 1,000 years ago, still is related with the current plant diversity in these communities, which means that this reflects the long history of these grasslands that were closer to human populations and closer to humans as long ago as 1,000 years ago, meaning that these were the ones that were managed and continuously likely managed throughout the centuries that bring us here. So this is the memory that we see in the grasslands, and these are the implications. This brings the implication also to the conservation, obviously. Here is another example from Sweden, where the change in the grassland structure throughout the years from 1700 to nowadays have led to are still visible in the patterns of biodiversity in these grasslands. So in here you can see the change, how the pink areas have declined over past centuries. Pink areas are semi-natural grassland and have been replaced by forest and other open lands. And the authors here distinguished continuity classes of the grasslands, trying to establish that how important is the historical kind of continuity of how long has this particular grassland been a grassland and managed continuously. And they distinguished continuity classes and saw that that this continuity, the age of the grassland, was important in determining the current biodiversity in these grasslands. So that for both specialists and generalist species, the number of species was higher for the older grasslands, meaning that species actually take a long time to accumulate in the habitats and stay there. And they stay there if they slowly kind of accumulate over not only years but even centuries. And if this pattern was detected for the whole grasslands, that the specialists and generalists both increased, but the proportion of specialists, when looking at very small scales, where species assemble in the small scales, in a plot scale, then the proportion of specialists was highest in the oldest grasslands. So this kind of pattern indicates, and this is not the only study now that has shown these kind of patterns, this indicates that we need to value the continuity in our conservation decisions as well. The second aspect, kind of ecological aspect, in addition to continuity, is the aspect of time lags that are also driven by past land use and the land use changes that has occurred since then. So if we currently see that the current species number is better explained by past landscape characteristics, let's say whether it is past habitat structure or past management scheme rather than current ones, then we might have witnessed something that is called extinction depth. Extinction depth is a phenomenon that has now been confirmed in many habitats that have lost a lot of area, like grasslands all over Europe, also in other habitats that have gone through big environmental changes over past century or decades. And here is one extinction depth example that we found in the Estonian grasslands, that our current species richness is better explained by historical habitat area before these big area losses, and not so well explained by the current habitat area. So you see these upper panels there. This means that although the habitat has decreased around the species that inhabit these remnant patches, the species themselves have not yet recognized it or understood that they now have to focus or have to carry their life cycles in much smaller conditions. But eventually they will, and eventually the species who can't tolerate so small areas, they will go extinct. And for Saaremaa Alvars or Estonian grasslands, where this pattern was detected, we predicted the loss of species around 25 to 40% of characteristic species that currently grow in these grasslands. So now one update to this study. This was already done in 2006, and now we have quite preliminary data also what has happened since. So in before 2006, we noticed that there is still this extinction depth in our grasslands, but now we already see that these grasslands that have not been restored and are still as small, they have actually already starting to lose the species that we predicted in 2006. So that it has been 13 years since. So these are worrying trends and showing that they really that we should really place our conservation aims in these issues. If we notice, let's say, extinction depth, we should really do something. For butterflies, which are the species that species group that responds much faster to changes because they are not so long-living as vascular plants that are in the upper scheme. They responded much faster to habitat changes. They show very limited extinction depth usually, also confirmed in other studies compared to plants. In a recent study done last year in Sweden, where historical land use was quantified for very large areas for the whole southern Sweden, the authors detected that historical landscape composition is much better predictor of present-day species richness than current landscape composition. And this applies not only, as I previously showed, in individual regions or places or grasslands, it also applies in the regional scale. And when they compare different habitat types or kind of broad habitat types, then the open landscapes had considerably decreased in the landscape heterogeneity since the kind of historical times or beginning mid-century, last century, indicating that these grasslands that we have been talking about mostly until now are the ones that really drive this. The loss of grassland really drives the kind of impacts also to biodiversity and really drives the landscape changes that we have been witnessing. So in more detail about the possible implications for conservation. So as the historical land use indeed has very long-lasting impact on habitats, on biodiversity, it also has thus very high potential to guide decisions that we make in conservation or habitat restoration. Here are a few examples that I compiled in order to illustrate this. First one comes from Estonian forests, actually, and how the knowledge of land use history can potentially help us make better decisions in the conservation. So here you see on the left-hand side, you see the forest cover, Estonian forest cover in 1940, around 1940s, which is, we had a lot less forest historically because we had a lot more grasslands. But nowadays the forest cover is exceeding 50% of the total mainland territory of Estonia. So it has considerably increased. However, when we did a very extensive study in Estonian forests, then covering more than 100 sites all around southern Estonia, we saw that the current forest biodiversity is very strongly related with the historical forest area or forest cover. And we tested different scales and different periods. As you can see this black box underneath, this shows that the colors indicate that these were the most important variables combined, describing the biodiversity of up to 3 groups: vascular plants, bryophytes, and lichens. So when you see number 3 in the scale of 2 kilometers and 1940 as a year, it means that this combination, 2 kilometers radius and 1940s forest cover, was the best predictor for all 3 groups of tested biodiversity groups, like vascular plants, bryophytes, and lichens. And this means that for these groups, indeed, there are some scales that are important. The 2-kilometer scale seems to be important for them. If there is more forest in 2-kilometer radius, they do much better. If there is, if this forest cover in 2-kilometer radius was there in 1940s, this is still, this is the impact that we see right now in these years. So current biodiversity is driven by historical forest cover in 2-kilometer radius. So what does it mean? It actually means that we can look, and we did look, our conservation areas in Estonia and looked whether they represent well these areas that were historically, indeed that had historically high cover of forest in this 2-kilometer radius. And we saw that indeed most of the current conservation areas focus exactly on these regions that had very high forest cover in 2-kilometer radius. But even more, they actually focus on the areas that have currently high forest cover in 2-kilometer radius, which is kind of logical as well, because you wouldn't place a conservation area focusing on forest to the places that are very little forested. But this still indicates that there is a room to think in these terms whether we are doing well in conservation in terms of the landscape and in terms of the historical landscape and in terms of what species actually require or what kind of trends and patterns they have. So this is just one recent study that we made to the Estonian Forest Management Board, RMK, recently. So we will see how well this knowledge will go into, let's say, forest management, because the decisions that we make now regarding the forest landscape, they impact the biodiversity in next 50 years or 100 years. So we need to be considerate. Another example of use of historical landscape structure comes from our very large-scale grassland habitat restoration project called Life to Alvars, that we are just finishing it right now. We have restored 2,500 hectares of overgrown calcareous alvar grasslands, have created infrastructure for grazing that is needed to maintain or keep these restored areas open, and we have involved more than 600 private landowners into these activities. So it's quite a big project. However, if to recall how we selected areas for this large-scale restoration project, then we used the prioritization based on the historical landscape structure. When we started this project, we were in a fear that this habitat type, this particular calcareous grassland habitat type, disappears in Estonia. It was very, very rapidly overgrowing everywhere where it was, and there was very little management in the remnants of these habitat types. So we really felt that we have to focus on saving the habitat type or avoiding the disappearance of this particular habitat type. So we selected first the regions that had high historical cover of alvars, so that the regions that had really a lot of this habitat historically already. And here you can see two examples. One is site 1 was eventually selected also for the restoration, and site 2 was not, although they both were recognized as having a big and kind of continuous historical areas. But as we really aimed for the saving of the habitat type, we decided that we really need to focus first on these core areas that also have some remnants left today. And in the second order, we would focus on those that have historically been big, but have very little left nowadays, when we are more experienced and when we can start focusing also on the, saving the particular aspects of this biodiversity. So this is the year. The site 1 was selected because it also has currently some remnants of this habitat type left. And example 3 comes from the local decisions that we can make in our conservation. So we call it here in Estonia igaühe looduskaitse, everyone's nature conservation, which is this kind of voluntary, individual, small-scale conservation actions that people can take. This year in June, Estonian Ministry of Environment has the whole month dedicated to everyone's nature conservation, and we try to reach to as many people with the recommendations of individual small actions that they can do to improve the condition of species and habitats in their neighborhood. Because biodiversity condition is such that everyone should and must act to improve biodiversity condition. So in this approach, it is actually also very important to have knowledge what habitats historically have been in this particular site, around my garden, in my town, in my village, because if there is a knowledge of these habitats, we can be, the actions that we take, even if we just take very, very small actions like we preserve some, we don't mow some patches, or we don't dig up some habitats, or cover them with I don't know, concrete. If we are knowledgeable of what is particularly worthy in this landscape, because it has historically been there and historically, covers this kind of legacy of landscape, then these small actions can be more impactful, I would say. And so, yes, I think that's all from me. I want to acknowledge or kind of summarize that actions that we take in conservation or restoration should be guided by historical land use knowledge. There is a lot of accumulating knowledge regarding the ecological aspects, but there is also accumulating possibilities to make use of historical maps. There are databases. Every country has now digitalized a lot of historical maps. We are already accumulating historical data regarding orthophotos, or even satellite pictures are starting to become historical in one point. And there is a lot of these technical possibilities to use the historical land use data to digitalize historical maps. We have used, for example, machine learning that recognizes green badges from 100-year-old maps in order to map the forest areas historically. And there are many possibilities now emerging as well. So I would really encourage everyone to think about history. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aveliina, for this very